Alright, so the clip that I was playing before class started was an album by the Brazilian thrash metal band Sepultura. It's called Dante 21, and it's all the songs on the album are based in some way on Dante's Inferno. And the reason I wanted to start with this and not with, say, like a piece of music from Dante's own time or culture, which is sort of the thing that I usually do, is because Dante has continued to have a massive impact on popular culture. And it's really, it's his great work, The Divine Comedy, that has shaped the way a lot of people conceive the afterlife. Right now, he's not using new materials, by and large, in the Inferno or its two companion poems. He is taking existing material and sort of synthesizing it into something new and different. But it's something new and different that lasts a good long time beyond Dante's own period. Don't think I don't see you back there.
Okay. Hi.
Hello. So other examples, right, of popular songs that reference Dante. I don't know how many of you are familiar with, I'm starting to feel my age lately. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Rage Against the Machine. Okay, at least one of you. Good. All right. All right. There's a Rage Against the Machine song called Roll Right, in which, during the bridge, Zach De La Rocha tells the listener to throw him in the seventh level, right? The seventh level is the circle of the violence in Dante's hell. There's a song by the Gaslight Anthem called The Navesink Banks. And what they're doing in that particular song is transposing the situation near the beginning of Dante's poem, where he's standing, at the river waiting for the ferryman to come and carry him across to enter hell with his guide Virgil. They are translating that situation to a river in New Jersey. So, yay Jersey. I'm going to give you another example. This comes from the television show Futurama. If somebody could hit the light back there. Great. Thank you, Kanisha. And what I would like you to do as you watch this, right, I would like you to think about ways in which this is directly drawing on or referencing Dante, right? Where do we see Dante's direct influence, apart from the fact that this is hell?
Ah, crap, singing. Mind if I smoke? Cigars are evil, you won't miss them. We'll find ways to simulate that smell. What a sorry fella, rolled up and smoked like a panatella. Here on level 1 of robot hell. Gambling's wrong, and so is cheating, so is forging phony IOUs. Let's let Lady Luck decide what type of torture's justified. I've been forced here on level 2. Ooh, deep-fried robots. Just tell me why. Please read this 55-page warrant. There must be robots worse than I. We checked around, there really aren't. Then please let me explain. My crimes were merely boyish pranks. You stole from Boy Scouts, nuns, and banks. Stop playing me, blame my upbringing. Please stop singing while I'm singing. Selling bootleg tapes is wrong. Musicians need that income to survive.
Hey, men are gonna make some noise with your hard drive backed by the Beastie Boys. That's what you get on level 5.
I don't feel well.
It's up to us to rescue him.
Maybe he likes it here in hell.
It's us who tempted him to sin.
Maybe he's back at the motel.
Come on, Fry, don't be scared. I'm sure at least one of us will be spared. So just sit back, enjoy the ride.
My ass has blisters from the slide.
Fencing diamonds, fixing cockfights, publishing indecent magazines. You'll pay for every crime, knee-deep in electric slime. You'll suffer till the end of time, enduring tortures, most of which crime. Trapped forever here in Rotherham. Of course, that's just for starters. Gentlemen.
Okay, so where do we see the direct influence of Dante here? Could you get the lights again, Kanisha? Thanks. In what ways is that drawing on the Inferno? Okay, yeah, everything's separated into different levels, right? There's a variety of different levels for different sins, and each and the punishments are different in each, right? Yes. Okay. So we get levels for different sins. Good. What else?
The punishments.
Okay, yeah, the punishments, right? What do you notice about the punishments?
They're similar to the ones in this story.
Okay, yeah, they're fairly extreme, right? Like being rolled up as a cigar and smoked, right? Being strapped to a giant wheel of fortune, being deep fried, right? Having his hard drive, the recording device inside him, removed, and then messed with by the artist he was stealing from, right, by making bootlegs. What these are all examples of, right? The way Dante describes punishments in the Inferno, right, is called the contrapasso, which in Italian means suffer the opposite. So, when Bender is strapped to that wheel of fortune, for example, right, his punishment is being decided by chance. Now, what is he being punished for?
Gambling.
Is he just being punished for gambling?
No.
For cheating, right? For fixing the game. So, because he tried to take chance and give it a predetermined outcome, right? The punishment he's given for that is being strapped to a wheel and having his punishment decided randomly, right? He's given over to chance. We see similar situations all throughout the Inferno, right? For example, in the circle of the lustful, you have these spirits who are constantly being blown apart from each other by winds. They're being blown, like their spirits are being blown apart because their physical bodies couldn't keep away from each other in life, right? So the punishment they're given reflects sort of the opposite of the sin that they committed, right? So these ideas persist, right? These notions persist. Our idea of hell largely comes from two sources. It comes largely not really from the Bible, but from Dante's Inferno, where we have a kind of amalgam of different ancient world traditions being translated into a Christian hell, and from Milton's Paradise Lost. Right? By and large, if you look at the way the devil behaves in the Bible, he is not confined to a place beneath the earth. Right? If you look for the book of Job, and in one of the Gospels, I forget which one, he shows up in the desert to tempt Jesus when he is fasting before the crucifixion, right? So in the Bible, the devil is free to operate in the world. He is not confined to hell. The idea that the devil is confined to hell is a relatively modern invention. Now, the idea that the devil rules hell is also a relatively modern one, and one that Dante does not subscribe to as well, right? In Dante's Inferno, the devil is a fellow sinner in hell, right? He's the worst of all the sinners. He's down at the bottom, frozen in that lake of ice, right, which is created by his own tears and spit. Right, forever punished, forever trapped, right? Okay, so what questions or observations do you guys have about this before we talk a little bit more about the worldview that created it, or its cultural context? Yeah, go ahead, DeMarcus.
That right there, why are there zodiac signs up there?
Okay, okay, well, this right here, I was going to get to this in a minute. Does anybody recognize what this is a picture of? This is actually not the Inferno. Nope.
The Ptolemaic universe.
This is the Ptolemaic universe, yes. So how is the Ptolemaic concept of the universe different from the way we envision the universe?
This, everything revolves around the Earth
Ye-
instead of the sun.
Yeah, it's the geocentric model, right? That was common before the 15th century, right? Before Copernicus. Right? Before we discovered that the Earth, in fact, orbits the sun and is one of many bodies that orbits the sun, right? So, in Dante's time, right, we believed that the Earth was at the center of all creation. And from a certain standpoint, it makes sense to think that, right? If you're just standing in a field and looking up into the sky, it looks like everything's revolving around you, right? It looks like everything is revolving around us. And if we notice that, like, heavenly bodies that we know now are not planets, right? We know that the moon does in fact orbit the Earth, but it's not a planet, it's a satellite. We know that the sun is in fact a star, it is not a planet. And most of us know that the zodiac is basically bullshit. But why is Saturn the last planet listed?
Probably couldn't see much farther than that.
Yeah, it's the last planet you can see with the naked eye. Yeah. It's the last planet you can see without advanced telescopes. Right? They didn't yet know that Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto existed. So beyond Saturn, you have the heavenly firmament, right? The belt that contains all the stars. You have the zodiac belt beyond that. And outside of all of this, Caelum Imperium Habitaculum Dei et Omnium Electorum. Or, to translate from Latin into English, the heavenly Empyrean habitat of God and all the saints. So outside of all of these spheres is where paradise is supposed to exist, right? Now, each of these planets is supposed to move within a predetermined orbit inside of a crystalline sphere. And when all of these planets are moving along their spheres, along their proper orbits, in harmony, it's supposed to create a note that you can hear if you're listening very, very closely, the so-called music of the spheres, right? So, the idea behind this, right, was a universe moving in harmony, right? An orderly creation with the earth at the center and God on the outside looking in, right? Making sure that everything flowed smoothly. And Dante's concept of the afterlife follows this kind of model, right? We have the Inferno, which is reserved for the punishment of sinners. We have the Purgatorio, which is for the redemption of redeemable sinners. And the Paradiso, which is where one meets God, the angels, and the saints. Right? Those who are either sinless or have had their sins burned out of them in purgatory, right? So what do we notice then about Inferno and Purgatorio, right? Does Dante seem to then regard all sinners as equal? Yeah, the Catholic Church still uses two different categories of sin, right? A mortal sin is the kind of sin that puts your soul immediately in peril, right? Murder, theft, excessive lust, treason, blasphemy. Right? These would all be things that are regarded as mortal sins. Venial sins are sins that are a little bit less serious, right? Telling little white lies. Maybe, going to church and not tithing every time. Cheating on your taxes a little, right? Things like that. Now, if you die with mortal sins unconfessed on your conscience, according to this scheme, you would go right to hell. You go right to the Inferno, right? If you die with venial sins that you have not confessed on your conscience, then you would go to purgatory. And the way Dante describes them, they're sort of inverses of each other, right? Could you get a sense of how hell is supposed to be shaped in Dante's poem? What's the shape of it?
Sphere?
Well, the earth is a sphere, right? And that's actually one thing that is very, very important to note, right? Did anyone at any time ever actually believe the earth was flat? The answer is no, right? We have never actually thought that the world was flat. Yes, Kathy?
Why are there people called flat earthers?
The flat earthers are a bunch of dead enders who, I don't know why they believe what they believe. But we have always known the earth was round, right? The Greeks managed to calculate the circumference of the earth in about, I think, like the 6th century BCE, right? You can't calculate the circumference of something you don't think is round. So yes, we have always known that the world was round. And in fact, Dante's scheme doesn't really work if you believe the earth to be flat. So yes, even in the 13th century when Dante was writing, yes, we knew the earth was round. However, what we did believe was that there was nothing on the other side of it, right? That it was just a vast expanse of empty ocean. So, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, the risk wasn't that he was going to sail off the edge of he was going to sail the edge of the earth and fall off, right? That wasn't the fear. The fear was that by the time he actually got to Asia, there's no way that he could carry enough food and fresh water to make it all the way across, right? So they believed that it was just empty ocean. However, Dante does place something in the middle of that empty ocean, right? So Dante's world is a sphere. In the middle of the northern hemisphere is the holy city of Jerusalem. And hell is a pit underneath Jerusalem, right? It's a funnel that goes downward, right? That was created when Satan fell from heaven. And then he's lodged there in the bottom, right? In that lake of ice. So here we have, at the bottom, our three-headed, gigantic, winged hairy devil, right? And on the other side of this, right, opposite Jerusalem, we have the land that was displaced by Satan's fall, right? This gigantic mountain, which I don't have enough room to really draw here. And this is Mount Purgatory. So the reason for Dante that you are not supposed to sail to the other side of the earth, this is the punishment that Ulysses / Odysseus suffers when we meet him sort of late in the poem. You're not supposed to go where living human beings are not meant to go, right? Right. The pillars of Gibraltar, between Spain and Africa, are supposed to set the limits of where human beings are supposed to go. And when you go beyond that, then you're going into God's realm. And your ship gets wrecked, and you drown, and you end up in hell. So, to get back to these whole sort of specific categories of sin, we talk about these contrapassos, these suffer the opposite punishments. We've talked a little bit over the last couple of sessions about the philosopher Plato, right? So does anybody remember what the basic idea of Plato's philosophy was?
What you see isn't exactly what the idea is meant to be.
Yeah.
Kind of
Pretty much, right? The idea, right, that the physical world, right, the world that we can take in through our senses, masks a higher reality. And that what the goal of philosophy should be is to access that higher reality, right? And to sort of bring people up into that higher reality. Now, more influential in the Middle Ages was Plato's student Aristotle. Aristotle was not interested in cataloging, or it was not interested in accessing a higher reality, right? What he was interested in was the world of sensations and describing and cataloging and categorizing things that existed in the visible, physical, material world. Right, so you know a thing, according to Aristotle, or you understand a category by examining its individual members. So, if I were, for example, to say Caitlin is a student, right? Student is the broad category that you belong to. Caitlin is the individual member of that subset, and I know what a student is by observing individual students, right? And noticing commonalities. Dante's afterlife is organized in very much the same way, right? Because medieval Catholicism is organized very much in that way, right? We have categories of sin, right? We have these two broad categories, mortal and venial sins, right? And then we have the sins that are represented in the poem, in part, at least by animals, right? We have the she-wolf, the lion, and the leopard. All right, let's look briefly on page 393 at the passage in which our pilgrim meets these creatures. Can I get a volunteer to read from about line 31, beyond the point the slope begins to rise?
Beyond the point, the slope
Thank you,
begins
Seth.
to rise, sprang up a leopard, trim and very swift. It was covered by a pelt of many spots, and everywhere I looked, the beast was there, blocking my way. So time and time again, I was about to turn and go back down. The hour was early in the morning then. The sun was climbing up with those same stars that had accompanied it on the world's first day. The day divine love set their beauty turning, so the hour and sweet season of creation encouraged me to think I could get past the gaudy beast, wild in its spotted pelt. But then, the good hope gave way and fear returned when the figure of a lion loomed up before me, and he was coming straight toward me. It seemed, with head raised high and furious with hunger, the air around him seemed to fear his presence. And now a she-wolf came, and in her leanness seemed wrapped with every kind of greediness. How many people she has brought to grief.
All right, thank you. You can stop there. So you have here the introduction of the three beasts of sin, right? Each represents a different broad category, right? The leopard, with its spotted pelt, represents sins of fraud. The roaring lion represents sins of wrath. And the she-wolf represents sins of incontinence. Now, by incontinence here, I do not mean being unable to control one's bowel functions, right? We're not talking about pissing your pants here. We are talking about inability to control one's impulses, right? So, sins of incontinence in Dante's worldview would be things like lust, gluttony, rage, right? Essentially, things that come from your emotions overriding your intellect, right? And he notes here, right, how many people she has brought to grief, right? The sins of incontinence are typically regarded by Dante as the least blameworthy because they simply revolve from a lack of self-control, and they rarely harm anyone beyond the sinner, right? Sins of wrath, right? That's when you commit acts of violence against creation, right? Now, this doesn't have to be physical violence. You will notice that Dante also includes, I mean, in addition to physical violence against the self and against others, and weirdly, suicide is actually rated as a more severe sin than harming others, right? Throwing away the gift of the body you were given. Blasphemy is regarded as a crime of violence against God. Charging interest on loans, right? Usury is regarded as an act of violence against nature, because using money to beget more money is regarded as an unnatural act, right? So we see here that there are sort of like these, like within these broad categories, there are all kinds of little subcategories, right? And all these subcategories together and the sufferings of individual sinners tell us something about the entire system, right? We learn the system by observing individuals within it, right? This is all very, very Aristotelian, right? Fraud is the worst because you are using your intellect, right? You're using the power of reason that you were given by God to harm others. All right, so where else do we want to go with this? Let's look at Canto 4 for a moment. So, this is the canto in which Dante and his guide first enter hell proper, right? And I think it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit about who Dante's guide is and why this particular guide is chosen for him. Right, so his guide is the shade of Virgil. Now, who's Virgil? Yeah, Roman poet wrote the Aeneid, right? Which we didn't read in this class, but we would talk about a little bit. Does anybody remember what the gist of Aeneid is? Think back to when we talked about Ovid and the Metamorphoses, and how the Aeneid was different from that.
The hero Aeneas survives Troy and starts and begins the city of Rome. That's somewhere around there.
Yep. Survives the fall of Troy. And, well, he founds the city that will eventually give the world the founders of Rome, right? So he's part of this chain that leads from one ancient civilization to another, right? One ancient civilization is destroyed. Aeneas will begin another. And I think we can get some sense of what's going on here if we look on page 404. We had not gone too far from where I woke when I made out a fire up ahead, a hemisphere of light that lit the dark. We were still at some distance from that place, but close enough for me vaguely to see that honorable souls possessed that spot. O glory of the sciences and arts, who are these souls enjoying special honor, dwelling apart from all the others here? And he to me, the honored name they bear that still resounds above in your own world, wins heaven's favor for them in this place. And as he spoke, I heard a voice announce, now let us honor our illustrious poet. His shade that left is now returned to us. And when the voice was silent and all was quiet, I saw 4 mighty shades approaching us, their faces showing neither joy nor sorrow. Then my good master started to explain. Observe the one who comes with sword in hand, leading the 3 as if he were their master. It is the shade of Homer, sovereign poet, and coming next, Horace the satirist. Ovid is the 3rd, and last comes Lucan. Since they all share one name with me, the name you heard resounding in that single voice, they honor me and do well doing so. So, in Dante's time, Homer, Virgil, Ovid, Horace, and Lucan would have been regarded as the 5 great classical poets. Right. These were the poets whose work was still picked apart and studied, that was required reading for all educated people in Dante's day, right? So I saw gathered there the noble school of the master of sublimest verse, who soars above all others like the eagle. And after they had talked a while together, they turned and with a gesture welcomed me, and at that sign I saw my master smile. Greater honor still they deigned to grant me. They welcomed me as one of their own group, so that I numbered 6th among such minds. So when Virgil leads Dante up to the group of great ancient poets, what happens? What do they do? Yeah. Do they just say, hi, how's it going? Nice to meet you, Dante Alighieri? Greater honor still they deigned to grant me. They welcomed me as one of their own group, so that I numbered 6th among such minds. Are they just letting him hang out with them? They're including him in the tradition, right? They're bringing him into the fold. They're saying, yes, you are one of us. You are like us. You are carrying on and transmitting the great tradition. You are chosen successor in the world above. Now, this is not simply ego talking on Dante's part, right? This is not just, oh, I'm so freaking great, all these ancient Greek and Roman poets want me in their club. This is part of a specific discourse that runs throughout the whole poem. Now, when we see Satan at the end of the poem with his three faces chomping on the three sinners, who are the devil's chew toys? Who are these three getting chomped upon?
Judas, Brutus, and Cassius.
Yeah, the one getting it the worst in the middle is Judas, yes, and the others are Marcus Brutus and Caius Cassius. Who are these guys? Who are Brutus and Cassius?
Part of the assassination of Caesar.
Yeah, these are the betrayers of Caesar. Right, the betrayers of Julius Caesar. And Judas, of course, we are all aware, is the betrayer of Jesus. So, what's weird about this? Who should be getting, like, people who commit treason get it the worst in hell overall, right? That's, yeah, the devil is regarded as the worst sinner in hell because he betrayed God, right? So that's why he's trapped in the ice. These three have it next worse because they're getting constantly chewed on by Satan. So why these three? Why make these three the second worst sinners in hell?
Well, maybe this is coming. Maybe I'm not putting this as intelligently as I would like to, but because those three kind of followed the devil, Satan's footsteps in betraying somebody very, very important to.
Okay, you're on the right track here, right? Yeah, you're on the right track, right? They have all betrayed someone very, very important, right? Cosmically and historically. So what that he's putting the betrayal of Caesar on just about the same level as the betrayal of Jesus?
Well, in Christianity, Jesus is a son of God, so there's that. So Judas basically betrayed God along, just kind of like how Satan betrayed God.
Right.
So there could be a theme there too.
Caesar was a god in the Roman state religion, right? But worshiping Caesar as a god to a Christian would be anathema, right? This was actually a big part of the reason why Christians were persecuted by the Romans, because they wouldn't worship Caesar as a god. So why is Dante putting Caesar on almost the same level? What does this suggest about what he cares about and what he values? Particularly when we couple this with his placing himself in the tradition of the classical poets. It might help if we think a little bit about where he's from as well, right? So Dante, Allegory, our poet, is from the city of Florence in northern Italy. When he wrote this poem, he was in exile from Florence due to the political machinations of a faction to which he was opposed. Right? But he regarded the people of Florence as the descendants of the people of Rome and of a peasant village in the mountains called Fiesole. And he believed that the Roman lineage accounted for all that was good and noble in Florence, and the heritage of Fiesole accounted for their pig-headed stubbornness and their willingness to stab each other in the backs. But what does this indicate about why he might value Caesar so much, or this classical tradition of learning? What does he see himself and his people as? Why does he use Virgil as a model?
Values the Roman tradition.
He values the Roman tradition, right? And is it just that he likes Rome, that he loves Rome? That Rome is great?
He values himself as like a Roman descendant.
Yeah, he's regarding himself as the inheritor of this tradition, right? That just as the Florentines are descendants of the Romans, right? This is where Rome is being carried forth in the present day, right? Aeneas fled from Troy, came to Italy to found Rome, right? Some Romans went north, founded Florence, and Florence is now the true descendant of Rome. And Dante is the poet of Florence, right? So he's placing himself in a historical continuum. Right. This is also, we notice that there are a lot of things in the Inferno that don't seem to make sense in a Christian concept of the afterlife. Right? We have beasts and characters from Greek and Roman mythology. Right? So essentially, a lot of what Dante has done is taken and transplanted the ancient Roman underworld into a Christian context, right? He's taking that older belief system. And remember too, the Romans thought that the underworld was a place you could actually visit, right? That you could actually get there from a lake called Avernus. If you could fight your way past the horrible sulfurous smell that tended to poison and kill everything that came too close to the lake. Right? Once again, like this is a real place under the earth, right? Inside the earth. And when you climb down Satan's hairy ass, you end up in at the bottom of Mount Purgatory on the other side. Yeah, the whole idea here, right? This is a continuation of Roman tradition, of classical tradition, right? And yet, if we're talking about medieval Europe here, right? We're talking about Europe in the 13th century. What language would work that was addressed to a scholarly audience probably be written in?
Latin.
Yeah, it would have been written in Latin, right? Latin was the language of the church. It was the language of international scholarship, right? It was a way for people, it was a way for scholars to get around the fact that they didn't speak the same home languages, right? Right? It's like, okay, okay, fine. I speak, Romanian, you speak French, whatever, right? But we both understand Latin, so we can communicate in Latin. Dante did not write this poem in Latin, despite the fact that he seems to view himself as the inheritor of the Roman tradition. Right? One of the features of this poem that makes it unusual is that it is written in the specific dialect of Florence, or what we call the vernacular language. Right. Vernacular language simply means, the everyday language that people speak, right? So, this isn't aimed at a specifically scholarly audience, right? This is aimed at a broad readership, or at the very least a broad listenership, right? Because more people would probably have had this read to them than would have actually read it. Yeah, the fact that he writes in the vernacular indicates that he's trying to reach ordinary people, and not just scholars and not just churchmen. In fact, does he seem to actually like the church as an institution all that much?
No, he puts a couple religious figures in hell.
Yeah, he puts a good number of them down here, right? There are a couple of popes down here, and always for very specific sins, right? There's a particular pope, for example, who is punished for a sin called simony, right? Simony is essentially the selling of church sacraments. Right? You're not supposed to make people pay to receive sacraments. You're supposed to give them out freely to the deserving, right? But a corrupt churchman who takes bribes is guilty of this particular sin. And so those who are guilty of this sin are stuffed into these flaming pockets of rock, right? As they would have stuffed their purses in life. So he's not in love with the institutional church. And this may be part of why he chooses the Florentine dialect rather than Latin to write in. A couple other things to note quickly as well. Everything in the poem works in threes. Right? And not just in the Inferno, right? The Divine Comedy, the whole poem, has three parts, right? There's Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. So three-part afterlife. We have three beasts, right, representing three broad categories of sin. Right, we have the she-wolf, the lion, and the leopard. How many faces does Satan have? You have three faces of Satan. Three sinners chomped in each face. And each poem in the Divine Comedy consists of 33 cantos. Except the Inferno, which has 34. Because that first canto in which he's wandering in the dark wood is not regarded as specifically part of the Inferno. It's regarded as an introduction to the whole poem. It also takes place over 3 days. All right, over Easter weekend. Right. He first enters Inferno on Good Friday and finishes his journey through paradise at midnight on Easter Sunday. So it's a 3-day journey. Why so many threes? Why is everything set up in threes?
Because of the Holy Trinity.
Exactly, yeah. It's modeled on the idea of the Holy Trinity. Right? Father, Son, Holy Ghost. And Satan's three faces, right? Nobody is really entirely sure what the colors of those three faces specifically are supposed to mean, but what is generally agreed upon is that the fact that Satan has three faces that are of different colors is supposed to be a kind of mockery of the Holy Trinity, right? It's a sort of disgusting or warped imitation. So let's look a little bit at the beginning of the poem, just to help us determine what kind of thing this is. Because in a poem that is so obsessed with categories, it is probably a good idea to be able to assign it to a category. All right, so if you look on page 392, can I get a volunteer to start reading from midway along the journey of our life?
Midway
Thank you, Sarah.
along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. How hard it is to tell what it was like. This wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn. The thought of it brings back all my old fears. A bitter place. Death could scarce be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came of it, I must talk about things other than the good. How I entered there, I cannot truly say. I had become so sleepy at the moment when I first strayed, leaving the path of truth. But when I found myself at the foot of a hill, at the edge of the wood's beginning, down in the valley, where I first felt my heart plunge deep in fear, I raised my head and saw the hilltop shawled in morning rays of light sent from the planet that leads men straight ahead on every road. And then only did terror start subsiding in my heart's lake, which rose to heights of fear that night. I spent in deepest desperation, just as a swimmer, still with panting breath, now safe upon the shore, out of the deep, might turn from one last look at the dangerous waters. So I, although my mind was turned to flee, turned round to gaze once more upon the paths that never let a living soul escape.
Okay, you can stop there. Thank you very much. Okay, so the situation that's set up at the beginning of the poem, right? We have our speaker, our pilgrim, wandering around in a dark wood, right? His feet have lost the true path, right? He doesn't know where he is. He's trying to get back to the road. Now, what this is an example of, really what the whole poem is an example of, in an extended way, is what's called allegory. Does anybody know what allegory means, what an allegory is?
A lot of references to different stories.
Sort of, yeah. Like an allegory is a story, a picture, right, a narrative, whatever, anything that means something on both a literal and symbolic level, right, something specific. So here we have, a wanderer trapped in a dark wood of error, right? The wanderer is supposed to represent the individual human soul, and the wood is supposed to represent the errors, the mistakes that lead one to sin, right? Whereas the road is the straight path that leads you to salvation, right? Now, all of this is fairly obvious because all of this is intentional, right? This is the meaning that the poet wants you to get out of this, right? Allegory is intentional, right? You are supposed to read this on two or more different levels. Now, sometimes, as in this case, the allegory will be primarily conceptual, right? We call that an allegory of ideas, right? Each thing in the literal narrative stands for some bigger idea outside the narrative. Historical allegory, on the other hand, refers to real people and events, right, that are sort of masked by pseudonyms. But you were intended to read an allegory on two levels. And this is sort of really part of how the medieval Catholic mindset worked, right? You were supposed to read the world in this way, right? To a medieval Catholic, the world was a book in which God had hidden meaning in every person, in every event, in every object. And so your task as a Christian, as a Roman Catholic Christian, was to figure out how to read that language of creation, right? How to look beyond the literal level of existence and see the divine message behind it. So, right, we do still have that influence of Plato there as well, even though Aristotle is more clearly referenced here. So, allegory was a really popular literary technique in the Middle Ages, in large part because this was how educated people saw the world. Right? This was the lens through which they were looking at their world. And the literature just ends up imitating that form, right? Now, this is a particular subcategory of allegory called the dream vision. What do we notice happens to our pilgrim as he starts to wander off the road? What does he do? What happens to him?
Falls asleep.
He starts falling asleep, yeah? And in fact, he faints or falls asleep a lot, right? Pretty much anytime he's crossing over into a new category or subcategory of sins, right? He swoons, right? He passes out, and then when he wakes up, he's in another place. So, dream visions were a particularly common form of medieval allegory. They're very, very popular. One of the best and most popular, how many of you are familiar with a poem called Sir Gawain and the Green Knight? Okay, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is not a dream vision, it's not an allegory, but the same poet, whose name we do not know, wrote another poem called The Pearl. And in that particular poem, there's a jeweler who is searching a field for a pearl of great price that he's lost. He falls asleep while searching, and while he's asleep, the pearl comes to him and explains that she's doing just fine, he should stop looking for her, that she is in heaven with God and everything's great, right? So the allegory here, the pearl is, it's not a literal pearl, it's a daughter who died in childhood. And so the basic message of the dream, right, is to give over your mourning, right? Stop mourning and go on with your life because your pearl is well, right? But yeah, the dream vision refers to the way in which it is presented, right? The central figure in the poem falls asleep, and then usually some sort of guide will come to him. Almost invariably him, it's almost always men. And lead him on a tour of a kind of allegorical afterlife. So yeah, that's basically what this poem is. Now, was there anything about what you read for today that you found particularly confusing or upsetting or difficult that you want some clarification on? Was there anything that just really didn't make any sense to you? Because I didn't have you read the entire poem because it's too long. I just had you read portions of it. about Dante or about any of this material?
Towards the end, where they were being escorted by the squadron of demons.
Okay.
Why did they run towards the end? Right after the demons had started getting stuck in the tar pit because they were going after that one guy.
Okay, yeah, so these particular demons, right, they're called Malabrancha, or evil claws. And a lot of their behavior is meant to be read as comical or clowning, but this is also the moment in the poem in which Dante feels himself to be in real danger. For a particular reason, right? Now, the sin that is punished in this particular little pocket is graft. Is everyone familiar with what, do you all know what graft is, specifically? Okay, graft is taking bribes for political favors, right? So simony is taking bribes for spiritual favors. Graft is taking bribes for political favors, right? You're a government official or a bureaucrat. You're in a position to help somebody, but you won't do so unless they slip you a little something, right? So that's what's being punished in this particular pit. Now Dante, as we noted, was exiled from Florence at the time that he wrote this poem, right? This was the crime that he was accused of. Right? He was accused of taking bribes to advance his friends. He protested his innocence till the day he died, and the charge was probably politically motivated. Right? He was sent away on a diplomatic mission to Rome, and while he was gone, his enemy's faction came to power and issued this warrant against him, so he could never go back to Florence. So yeah, so that's why he and Virgil run from the Malabrancha, right? Why he doesn't trust them, why he's afraid of them, why he doesn't want to talk to them, right? Because graft is his own. It's not the sin he actually committed, but it's the sin he was accused of committing, right? So yeah, that's what's going on there. That's what's important with that. All right. Other questions? Anything else?
I'm not sure if this pertains to what we were talking about in regards to Dante and Inferno, really, but aren't there certain sections of the place that kind of have punishment type areas for each of the 7 deadly sins or
okay,
whatever?
Yeah, the 7 deadlies are the different layers of Mount Purgatory.
Because I think I remember reading about somewhere about one for lust, and people were being whipped or something like that.
That would be, you're thinking of, the second poem in the sequence is the Purgatory. Now, those punishments are intended to get the sins out of people's systems so they can progress on their way up into paradise, right?
Okay.
So so the souls in purgatory actually do have hope of getting out.
Okay.
None of the souls in hell do. Hell is where you go to stay. All of these souls have been declared ineligible for salvation. And so, you may notice that in some of these sections, the souls will ask for some other kind of recompense or some other kind of immortality from Dante. Like when he meets his old teacher, for example. Let me see. I'm trying to remember where the hell that is. All right, page 442. So he's running along this race course with his old teacher, Brunetto Latini. And page 443, Brunetto says to him, remember my Tresor, right? Remember the book I wrote, where I live on. This is the only thing I ask of you. And there are other shades as well who ask Dante to remember them in the upper world, right? Brunetto's not the only one who asked this of him. Because these are souls that have no hope of ever going to heaven. So the only measure of salvation or redemption they can receive is to remain in the memories of the living. Now, does this sound familiar at all? Where else have we seen this kind of idea? Yeah, in the Odyssey, right, where all of the shades are asking Odysseus, hey, how's my son doing, right? Where's my son? In fact, there's a shade who specifically asks Dante, where's my son, right? What's going on with my son? But yeah, that was the basic idea in the ancient world, right? Was that the afterlife was nothing, right? The afterlife didn't matter. What mattered was how people remembered you in the upper worlds. So this is another transposition of that older pagan afterlife concept into Dante's Christian framework, right? If you're stuck in hell, if you're still stuck in the pagan part of the afterlife, then there's no hope for you other than that people will remember you, right? There's no hope for you other than that someone up in the world above will occasionally think of you fondly. So it's another way that Dante is participating in this kind of invented tradition, right? Drawing a lineage back from 13th century Florence through Rome back to Troy. All right, any other questions? What else you got?
How much of his casting with specific people in certain circles is basically his burn book?
Some of it, although he has been accused of that. Right? He's been accused of putting his friends in heaven and his enemies in hell. But he does, in fact, put some of his friends and allies in hell. Brunetto Latini, the guy we were just talking about, this was a person whom Dante loved and respected. But because of the sin that Dante was aware Brunetto had committed in life, he still places him in hell, right, after Brunetto's death. So it's not all burn book. And in fact, some of the people from the enemy faction, a little bit of background here, just briefly. The two factions in Florence during Dante's lifetime were called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs were, by and large, the city people, merchants, traders, things like that. The Ghibellines were the country nobility. The Ghibellines are eventually banished by the Guelphs, and then the Guelphs split into two factions. The black and the white Guelphs. The black Guelphs want to ally the city of Florence more closely with the Pope and with Rome. The white Guelphs want the city to maintain its independence. Dante was a member of the white Guelph faction. So there are people down here who are Ghibellines or black Guelphs who do get a little bit of the burn treatment. But there are also some members of Dante's own faction who get it as well. And burn is actually not entirely inaccurate when we're talking about Dante's vision of hell, because are all of these punishments fire-based? In fact, the worst are cold, right? If you get down to the very, very bottom, people are frozen in a lake of ice, right? What it does seem to be based on, right? the one pattern you do see in terms of that is that at the upper levels, people are in furious motion, and as you work your way down, they get more and more still until you have, Satan frozen in his chunk of ice, right? All right, that is about all we have time for. We're going to be looking at the 1001 Nights, the first half of it for next time. So, to give you some leading questions for that. I believe we will have a presentation group speaking next time, none of whom appear to be here. So, all right. Let's hope they remember.